As many of you have pointed out, there's a wide variety of narratives from former slaves. When we read these, it is important to also take into account the historical context in which they were written, and the fact that history and memory are complex and they don't always reconcile. When reading accounts of slavery, keep in mind that many former slave narratives were recorded in the 1940s by white census workers. As a former slave speaking to federal workers, many simply told them what they thought they wanted to hear, or perhaps chose to remember the positive things about their former lives. Remember, these are individuals who have been conditioned from birth to appease whites. Also, many of these individuals knew nothing beyond having been a former slave. Their concept of freedom was limited, as were their short experiences with it. As humans, we draw off our own personal experiences, whether they be positive or negative. As some have noted, depending on the narrative, some slaves spoke of positive aspects of their enslavement, and not all masters were completely hated. Other former slaves reflect on the quote, good old days, then proceed to detail their abuse at the hands of their masters. So, why is memory of enslavement so complex? Well, it is because the methods of controlling slaves were complex and not always centered around violent punishment. For example, Southern white slave owners employed several tactics to keep slaves at bay that included violent punishment, slave codes or laws, religion, fear, and distraction. Now, African Americans were not naturally born slaves in their native land. They had been proud, free, and independent people. As slaves, many rebelled, more ran away, and most often slowed down on the job. They would do this by avoiding work or deliberately breaking tools or pretending not to understand commands. These forms of slave resistance presented a real problem, an ever-present problem for their masters. The best way to manage slaves, therefore, was often a topic of conversation among slave owners and in Southern magazines, which were full of advice on how to manage, handle, discipline, and break slaves. As time wore on, an elaborate system of controls was developed. It included whippings, slave laws, the use of religion, as well as constant punishment and intimidation. All these methods were designed to control slaves and keep them working. None of them were completely successful, but they help explain why slavery lasted for 250 years. Now, of course, concerning violent punishment, the most common form was whipping. Not everyone had to be whipped, though, or be beaten to fear this violent punishment. Violators of slave codes were often made an example of, and this was often done publicly, as we'll talk about in just a second. But before we do that, this is an excerpt from a famous Northern architect named Frederick Law Olmsted. He made 3 trips through the South. His purpose was to learn through personal observation how slaves were treated. Olmsted wrote several books describing what he found. His reports are often cited as the most objective description of life in the South because they seem to be related without bias. Paradoxically, he characterizes the beating described in the following selection as, quote, the worst case of punishment that I saw in the South, and as not unusual. It occurred while the writer was accompanying a slave overseer on a routine inspection tour of the plantation. After finding a young woman hiding at the bottom of a gully, the slave overseer said, "Get down on your knees." The girl knelt on the ground. He got off his horse and struck her 30 or 40 blows across the shoulders with his whip. At every stroke, the girl winced and yelled, "Yes, sir. Ah, sir. Please, sir." but did not groan or scream. Finally, he stopped and said, "Now tell me the truth." The girl repeated the story that she had told him before. "You have not got enough yet," he said. "Pull up your clothes, lie down." The girl drew her dress under her shoulders and lay down on the grass with her face towards the overseer. He continued to hit her with the rawhide whip, across her naked thighs with as much strength as before. She now shrunk away from him, screaming, "Oh, don't, sir. Oh, please stop. Master, please, sir. Oh, God, master, do stop. Oh, God, master." I glanced again at the overseer. His face was grim and businesslike. He did not seem angry or excited. Was it necessary to punish her so severely? He stated, "Oh, yes, sir," laughing. "If I hadn't punished her so hard, she would have done the same thing tomorrow. The next day, half the people on the plantation would have followed her example. Oh, you have no idea how lazy these blacks are. You northern people don't know anything about it. They would never work at all if they were not afraid of being whipped." So as you can see, it was not just the act of being whipped, it was also the fear of being whipped that kept people in line. Now, more important than punishing every slave violation that took place with violence was to keep the majority of the slave population subdued through fear. An effective way of achieving this was through public punishment, in which certain violators were made examples of. In this excerpt, former slave Robert Totley states that the biggest whipping I ever heard tell of was when they had a trial of several slave men for selling liquor at the spring during preaching on Sunday. The trial came off the church about 1 month later. They were convicted, and the order of the court was Edmund to receive 100 lashes, Sam and Andy each 125 lashes, and Frank and Abram 75 lashes. Also be given on their bare backs and rumps, well laid on with a strap. In addition to this, slave codes were also a method of controlling slaves in the South. Slave codes were rules made up for slaves which were the law of the state. Every southern state had a set of slave codes. Often one state would copy the laws passed by another, so the slave codes were usually quite similar all over the South. The following is quoted from the Louisiana Slave Code of 1852. Number 1, the slave owes to his master and all his family total respect and absolute obedience. He must instantly obey all orders he receives from them. 2, no slave can own anything of his own without the consent of his master. No slave can sell anything he has made without his master's consent. No slave can be a witness in any case against a white person. Slaves shall always be considered real estate and may be mortgaged according to the rules of law. No slave shall be allowed off of his plantation without written permission from his master. If a slave willfully strikes a white person to cause shedding of blood, the slave shall be punished with death. And finally, any person who teaches a slave to read and write shall be imprisoned for no less than 1 month or more than 12 months. Now, these codes or laws only applying to African American slaves were effective rules when they were combined with the threat of violent punishment. For many, the written threat was enough to keep them docile, law-abiding servants. Perhaps the most effective way of controlling slaves in the American South was through the utilization of religion as kind of a psychological warfare to control any thoughts about freedom. Slaves were essentially told that it was their duty to God to dearly serve their masters' every whim, that this was their reason for existence, and if they don't obey, they will not go to heaven. Slaves were indoctrinated at an early age with southern forms of Christianity that emphasize their servitude and complete obedience. Sundays and religious holidays were often and usually the only days off for slaves, so the importance of religion in their lives was even more emphasized, and white slave owners took advantage of this by holding religious festivals that would further distract from thoughts of freedom and rebellion. The following sermon was preached to slaves by a minister of God. It was considered so good that it was printed in a magazine to give other masters ideas of the kind of religious preaching slaves should receive. It states, "I have just shown you the chief duties you owe to your great master in heaven. I will now tell you duties to your masters and mistresses here upon earth. You must have one rule that you must always have in your minds, that is, serve your masters as if he were God himself. Poor creatures. You don't consider that when you are idle and neglect your master's business, and whatever faults you are guilty of. These are faults against God himself. If you steal from your master, you are stealing from God himself. If you tell lies to your master, you are telling lies to God himself. When you steal and waste your master's good, when you are saucy and wise, when you are stubborn or sullen, you are sinning not only against your master, but also against your master in heaven. From this rule, that all ye do unto your master, ye do unto God himself. There are several other rules which I will teach you. You are to be obedient to your master in all things. You are not to be eye servants. Eye servants are those who will work hard and seem busy when they think they are being watched. When their master's back is turned, they are idle and they don't do their work. You are to be faithful and honest to your masters, not wasting their goods, but showing all goods in all things. You are to serve your masters with cheerfulness, reverence, and humility. You are to do your master's service with goodwill. You should serve him as you would God, from the heart, without any sauciness or answering back." Nevertheless, with all these tactics employed to keep slaves subdued, rebellion still did occur, and it was the slave owner's job to keep slaves both fearful and somewhat appeased through law, labor, religion, and occasionally religious festivities. By occasionally throwing slave parties in which they were allowed to drink, dance, and be merry, masters were able to distract from harsh conditions, subdue rebellions, and most importantly, emphasize the role of the master as being supremely in charge. This is very much the same tactic that the political philosopher and demagogue Niccolo Machiavelli suggested to Italian rulers as a way to appear both powerful and generous. In his book, The Prince, Machiavelli states that a ruler should entertain the citizen with festivals and spectacles at suitable times of the year. He should show himself the prime example of courtesy and generosity, while always maintaining the majesty of his rank, which he must never abate. In other words, strategically timed spectacles in religious ceremonies, aside from distracting slaves' attention from more serious issues and keeping them too busy to conspire against you, will improve the slave owner's reputation and standing amongst the slaves. Need to divert attention away from a problem? Have an extravagant festival or religious ceremony. Everybody loves a spectacle. Now, these are just 5 of the main tactics utilized and widely discussed in Southern print of the time as a means of retaining complete control over their labor force, being slaves, and thus their economy. They go hand in hand here. So as you can see, many memories of slavery are very complex and often include a combination of positive and terrible experiences. However, it is important to keep in mind that both these experiences, positive and negative, were carefully curated and discussed as a way to retain control of an entire race of people.